The sky hasn't been anything close to normal in a long time. Some days it burns a dull red, like the world is trapped under a dying sun. Other days it hangs low and swollen with ash, an endless bruised canopy pressing down on everything that's left. But blue, a clean, open blue like the one I grew up under, that color died long before the country did. I remember thinking that the collapse would be loud, nuclear sirens, riots, explosions, an instant tearing of civilization. But the truth is, America didn't fall in a single moment. It crumbled slowly like a body giving out piece by piece. First the storms, then the droughts, then the fires. By the time the flooding came, the land was too scorched to even drink the rain. Everything we built was already fragile, already shaking, already ready to break. Now the world looks like a graveyard of what it used to be. The highways that once hummed with life are nothing more than cracked strips of concrete, swallowed by sand and invasive weeds that thrive in the heat. Cars sit abandoned in the middle of the road, half buried like tombstones. Their metal frames have melted into strange shapes from the sun's relentless glare. The billboards, once screaming for attention, are faded ghosts, half-peeling slogans for products no one remembers or needs anymore. Cities didn't survive well. Concrete holds heat, and in the era of permanent summer that turned skyscrapers into ovens, windows burst, steel warped, streets buckled. Even the shadows are dangerous, hiding pockets of stagnant air so hot they can kill you in minutes. The once familiar skyline of any major city is now just a jagged silhouette of charred bones. Whatever wasn't destroyed by heat was taken by floodwaters later on, when the coasts were swallowed whole. It's strange, walking through a place you once knew by heart only to see it twisted into something unrecognizable. Neighborhoods that used to echo with laughter and car engines are now nothing but shells. Burnt-out houses, collapsed roofs, and yards turned to deserts. The trees are gone. Grass is gone. Even the birds left long before we realized we should have, too. Water is the new currency. Food is whatever you can scavenge. And sunlight, the thing we once worshipped, is a threat now. Exposure is deadly if you aren't covered. The temperature swings are violent. Daytime hot enough to boil the moisture off your skin. Nighttime cold enough to bite through the thin layers people wear to conserve energy. Nothing about the climate behaves the way it used to. Nothing is predictable. Nothing is safe. Most of the old institutions collapsed under the weight of panic and scarcity. The government fractured, first struggling to maintain order, then trying to manage evacuations, and finally just disappearing. Communication networks fell. Power grids shattered. Airports shut down. Whatever remained of organized authority retreated into fortified zones, the kind regular people were never allowed to approach. Rumors say they still exist somewhere, in underground facilities or sealed-off bunkers, but no one I've met has ever seen them. Now, what's left of civilization is scattered and fragile. Small survivor groups cling to whatever scraps they can find. Abandoned warehouses, old fire stations, underground parking garages that offer shade and protection. Some groups try to rebuild. Others turn feral, preying on anyone who's weaker or alone. We call them raiders, though the term doesn't fully capture the desperation that drives them. Then there are the nomads, the ones who move constantly, following rumors of cooler land or clean water. Most die along the way, but some survive, long enough to spread stories that give the rest of us a little hope, even if it's foolish. What scares me most isn't the people, though, it's the quiet. There's a kind of stillness in the world now that never used to exist. No engines, no chatter, no distant planes cutting across the sky. The world feels hollowed out, emptied. Sometimes I pause in the middle of my walk just to listen, hoping for something, anything to break the silence. A sign of life, a sign of change, a sign that the earth hasn't given up on us completely. But most days, all I hear is the wind dragging dust across asphalt and the crackling of far-off wildfires that never seem to die. Even the air tastes different, like metal, smoke, and decay. Breathing it too deeply can make you dizzy. Staying outside too long can leave your skin blistered. Masks aren't optional anymore. They're survival. And even then, the dust gets everywhere, in your pack, your clothes, your lungs. You learn to live with the constant burn in your throat. Landmarks I once used to navigate by are now barely more than misshapen ruins. The old radio tower, the one I could see from almost anywhere in town, collapsed during one of the superstorms 2 summers ago. The river that used to cut through the valley has dried into a cracked basin where desperate people dig through the mud in hopes of finding a damp patch beneath. Sometimes they do. Most times they don't. This is the new world, a place where nature has stopped being gentle, where survival isn't a right but a fight, and where every sunrise dares you to keep going. And despite everything, I do. Because even in all this ruin, even with the fear, the hunger, the shrinking horizon of hope, I still believe someone out there is listening. I still believe there's a reason to keep the radio on. I used to wake up to an alarm and the smell of coffee. Now I wake to static and the slow hiss of a generator that sounds older than I am. I am Miles Harrington, if that name still matters to anyone out there, but names matter less now than voices. My voice is what I have left that feels like it belongs to the world we lost. I run the station because someone must keep the signal alive. Someone must say the words that make other people keep breathing for a few more minutes. I am a radio broadcaster by accident and a survivor by necessity. Before the fall, I worked in a warehouse, then a little at a community college teaching part-time. I liked maps and old broadcast equipment, old men's jokes, and the smug certainty that the future would always be there for us to step into. That certainty evaporated. I learned how fragile infrastructure is the day the power grid hiccuped for the first time and never recovered. When the cities started to choke and the pumps failed, I took what I could carry, pedaled my bike to higher ground, and scavenged the parts that would keep a transmitter alive. The shack where I broadcast is half an old radio repair shop and half a salvaged closet. It smells like solder and old paper. The transmitter is a jury-rigged thing held together with copper wire, zip ties, and prayer. I have a pedal generator for when batteries die, and I charge solar cells when the sky cooperates. Fuel, when I can find it, is hoarded like medicine. I split it into tiny doses, one for the generator, one for a stove when the nights are bitter. I learned to sleep in 10-minute intervals so I can listen to the static and react to voices that might be calling for help. Survival is a series of small, repeated decisions. Where to find water, how to carry it without losing too much, when to move and when to stay put. I have a routine because routines save your mind when everything else wants to pull it apart. Before dawn, I check the rain traps I've set on the roof. Even a single cup of clean condensation can mean the difference between rationing and real thirst. I mark spots on maps where I've found wells that still trickle, caches of canned food hidden in basements, and places where the looters left more than they took. I trade what I can, tools, batteries, the occasional clean shirt, for things I don't have. Medicine, a pack of rice, an old battery that still holds a charge. My hands tell the story of the last few years. They are a cartography of scars and calluses. There is a burn on my forearm from trying to coax a stove to life in a house that didn't want to be warmed. There is a thin, pale line across my knuckle from a barbed wire fence I had to cut through at night. There is a faint white crescent on my palm where I once gripped a tiny photograph of a woman and a child and forgot to let go. I touch that scar sometimes when the nights are loud and my fingers wander for something human to hold. I lost Anna the winter the blackout became permanent. She was small and fierce, and she used to hum off-key when she stirred oatmeal. The storm that took her wasn't cinematic. It was silent, a slow slide of sickness and lack of medicine. We ran out of antibiotics in 3 days. The local clinic had been looted weeks earlier. I can still picture her hand on my chest, a warm, stubborn weight that trusted me. I failed her in the ways that matter to men who survive. I could not stop the small, creeping things that hunger into the body when the world forgets how to care. There is also Jonah. I lost him another way by staying alive when he didn't. He was the person who taught me to fix radios. He died at the crossroads when we argued about sharing supplies with a group who smelled like smoke and guns. That argument feels like a lifetime ago, but the memory is sharp. The guilt presses on me like the weight of a heavy backpack that never seems to get lighter. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I could have done more. Sometimes I decide that I did what I could with the choices I had. Then guilt comes back and knocks on the window again. What keeps me going is not revenge or stubbornness alone. It is a complicated, stubborn knot of responsibility, memory, and the need for connection. People still tune in, now and then, on frequencies that I hold like a small fire against the dark. They call in with voices that are thin and trembling, and it's as if the world reformats itself briefly into something that makes sense. I read their messages aloud. Where water can be found, what roads to avoid, who has been hurt. Sometimes I play a cassette, old music that sounds foreign now because it was recorded before the sky forgot its blue. These are small rituals, but rituals stitch people back together when everything else has unraveled. There is also the ridiculous, human need to be known. When you survive long enough in the quiet, anonymity becomes a kind of death. I tell stories because narratives are how we smuggle meaning from one day into the next. I tell the listeners about the sound of rain when it was rain, about the way city lights used to look like scattered stars, about how my father once fixed a clock by humming to it. Those memories are contraband, but they are mine to trade. They remind me that I am still capable of feeling and remembering and missing. I am not a hero. Heroes in the old stories were clean and decisive and always prepared. I am improvisation and ration labels and old cookies in a tin. I have lied to survive, said there was more food than there was to keep a frightened man from leaving to die alone, promised aid. I didn't have to calm a woman who'd lost a child. I have stolen when I needed to. I have also given when giving could have cost me everything. Survival has an economy of its own, and morality shifts with the seasons. Sometimes the right choice is painfully selfish. Sometimes it is reckless generosity. I do my best, and my best bends a lot. People ask me sometimes whether I broadcast to be heard or to hear. The answer is both. The radio is my mirror and my lifeline. When a voice answers from somewhere miles away, I am reminded I am not the only human left. When the microphone is off and the generator is silent, the emptiness feels heavier. That's when the past threatens to swallow me. That's when I count supplies and remember Anna's laugh and feel how the world has carved away at me. There are quiet pleasures in this life that stubbornly refuse to disappear. Sun-warmed metal is a small comfort. The precise moment when a sore throat eases with 100-year-old cough syrup you found in a pharmacy is almost sacred. The bartering of knowledge, telling a teenager how to rig a rain trap in exchange for a fresh loaf of bread, feels like holy work. These small exchanges are scaffolding for the future, even if the future is only a rumor told by someone who has walked farther than I have. I keep a list of names taped to the inside of my radio cabinet. Mostly they are places and times. Old Mill Well, April, 23, or Crossroads, Red Barn, June. But there are also real names, scribbled in a hand that used to make grocery lists and now makes maps of survival. Jonah, Anna, Mrs. Klein, who taught me to mend clothes and who left a spool of thread in a drawer for me to find. Each name is a breadcrumb, and each breadcrumb is a promise that somewhere, someone mattered. At night, when the wind pushes dust against the windows and the world seems to sigh, I tell myself I'll stop when the signal goes dark. I tell myself that one day the map will be full again, that the rivers will remember how to run, and that the sky might one day find its way back to blue. Hope in this age is not grand or certain. It is a stubborn, quiet thing that refuses to die. It's enough to keep me turning the crank on the generator when the batteries are dead. It's enough to make me read into the static, into the thin voices that respond, because human speech itself is a declaration of existence. So I go on. I fix antennas with a trembling wrench and set a thermos of coffee beside the microphone. I file reports and read names and share the little knowledge that keeps people alive. I am tired. I am broken in ways that never fully show. But there is work to be done, and as long as I have a voice and a transistor that listens, I will use them both to make the world a little less empty. Because even after everything, someone might be listening. Someone might still be holding on. And if my stories and my warnings and my misfires can save one person from a storm or give one lonely heart a reason to rise in the morning, then the signal was worth keeping alive. They told us the crisis would be slow. They never promised it would be considerate. For years the weather behaved like a jury, deliberate and cruel. Heat came in waves, each one stronger than the last, until the idea of an ordinary summer became a relic. Rivers that used to argue through towns became nothing more than scars in the earth. Lakes cracked like porcelains. Reservoirs shrank into a string of black puddles that smelled of rot and algae. Crops failed in cycles nobody had prepared for. Seeds that used to sprout every spring lay dormant or returned brittle and dead. What we're living through now is not a single event. It's a braided catastrophe, drought, wildfire, and the strange violence of storms that arrive like bruises. The drought dug the hole. The fires made the hole deeper. Then, when the sky finally loosened a fistful of rain, it came in a way the ground couldn't take. Not gentle, sustained rain, but violent torrents that slid over hardened soil and pulled the topsoil away in sloughs and mudflows. So when the floods came, there was nowhere for the water to go. It rolled like a hungry thing and took what was left. Science used to give names: megadrought, heat dome, atmospheric rivers. But in the end, the labels feel like catalog cards beside a disaster. The mechanics were, in a stripped-down way, simple and terrifying. Warmer oceans hold more water vapor. Warmer air holds more heat. The jet stream, which used to swing with a certain temper, began to stall, big loops that parked weather systems and refused to move. Where it got stuck, we got an unrelenting season. Weeks of fire weather, weeks of rainless heat, or weeks of black, ash-filled skies. The feedback loops kicked in, forests that burned released carbon that warmed the air more. Permafrost thawed and gassed the atmosphere. Drought killed vegetation that used to hold soil in place. Each loop made the next season harder. On the radio, I try to explain some of this when the mood allows. People need sense as much as they need water. Explanation feels like a bandage. I'll say it as plainly as I can. When the ground is baked hard, it can't absorb water. And when you finally get water that falls in a single night, that water runs off, carrying the thin, precious layer of soil with it. You can't grow food without soil. You can't drink water without filtration. The math of it is merciless. Survival, every day, is a ledger with more debts than credits. We ration water to the point that your tongue learns new ways to make do. A cup of coffee has become a sacrament because it signals that something was found, bartered, or stole. Food is scavenged. Canned goods from warehouses where the climate hasn't yet turned them into hazards. Root vegetables dug from gardens that somehow clung to moisture underground. And occasional livestock traded for tools. Fuel is the cruelest scarcity. Without fuel, the generators die. Without generators, the radios go quiet, pumps stop. Even solar is unreliable now. Ash in the air reduces output. Dust coats panels, storms break arrays. Batteries are hoarded like relics. We trade medicine with hushed urgency. A box of antibiotics can save someone's life and buy you a winter's worth of rice. People press into the space left by the failing institutions in different ways. Some formed cooperative enclaves, small, organized bands that pool skills and keep watch. We have one such cluster 2 valleys over. They have a hand-pumped well that still yields a slow, tenacious stream. They trade water and labor for radio updates and knowledge. Who knows how to treat a burn, how to rig a water trap where flood levels are rising? Other groups saw the collapse as a license to take. Raiders, people who once might have been farmers or mechanics, move in packs, ruthless in the newest economy where force equals food. Between the helpers and the predators are the many who drift. Nomads who follow rumors of green valleys or functioning wells, and usually die a week or two later, or the stubborn who hole up in ruined buildings and refuse to leave. I've met all of them. There was the woman with a metal tray and a baby on her hip who begged for water at the edge of town. She cried when I gave her the last of a rationed bottle, promising to return the favor if she survived. There was the caravan of traders from the north who arrived dusty and sunburned, carrying solar panels lashed to the sides of a battered truck. They taught me how to splice a failed inverter in exchange for a month's worth of batteries. There were the raiders too, 4 of them who came the night the generator sputtered and wanted our fuel. They smelled like smoke and anger. They told jokes to hide their fear. They aimed weapons at children and rationalized it with logic about survival. We paid them a price in food and a bandage, and they left with the kind of grudging respect that feels like a wound. Trust is measured in small acts. You learn who will hold the line when the storms hit, and who will be gone at dawn. You learn the difference between someone who will bring you a patch for a torn tent and someone who will return with a knife instead. I am careful with trust because every miscalculation costs water or blood. Severe weather is not just a background threat now. It is a living antagonist. Last summer, a heat dome parked itself over the region for 21 days. Thermometers cracked at 118 degrees F. Asphalt melted into sticky rivers in the streets. Car batteries exploded from the heat. The nights offered no relief. The heat clung to your throat and turned sleep into a thin, hateful film. People died in their homes, hands the color of paper. We ran out of cold packs and morphine and the small lexicon of comfort. The fires were particularly vicious, tree-lined blazes that fed on the wind, moving faster than people expected, jumping rivers and roads in a single night. I learned to read the sky the way sailors once read waves. When the wind goes from a dry east to a hot southwest and the smell changes, it means fire is near. And then there are the storms that bring toxic rain, acidified sheets that fall after industrial sites are breached by floodwaters. We treat these like living things you don't want to touch. They ruin crops the way a blight ruins orchard, and they eat paint off buildings and leave a metallic taste in water you might otherwise try to salvage. Last winter, a storm blew through that carried ash from 3 different wildfires. It fell like a snowfall and choked people who were foolish enough to work without masks. We had more than one community unknowingly harvest crops coated in ash and spend 2 desperate weeks treating abdominal infections. If there's a single reason survival gets harder day by day, it's the compounding of small failures into cataclysmic ones. A broken pump goes unrepaired because the person who knew how to fix it left or died. A barn collapses in a storm because the roof was thermally stressed and dry rot set in. One well is contaminated by a flood that breached a septic field, then 2, then a dozen. The knowledge that once lived in towns, how to cure a joint infection, how to splice a solar wire, how to read the map of a river, has been thinned. That thinning creates vulnerability. We respond to vulnerability by hoarding, and hoarding fractures the cooperative networks that could have pooled resources to solve bigger problems. It's a perverse arithmetic. Fewer skills, right arrow more scarcity, right arrow more hoarding, right arrow fewer skills. Within my own small radius, our limitations feel intimate. We have the transmitter, yes, but it's a fragile thing. A miswired capacitor can take it down for days. We have 3 batteries that hold life for the system when the sun is thick with ash. We have seed packets, but many contain varieties not well suited to the new climate. Late blight and heat stress killed our early attempts at communal farming. We have medicine in dribs and drabs. 1 vial of insulin left for a neighbor who somehow survived with diabetes. A box of 15 broad-spectrum antibiotics that we ration like gold. We have 2 functioning vehicles and a handful of odd parts stashed in a crate marked "may blow up." Ammunition is a word we whisper. It's rare, and every bullet is a decision. So we adapt. Some of our adaptation is ingenious in a way the old world would have admired. We set up solar stills from old plastic bottles, dangerously low tech, but they squeeze condensation out of gray water when the nights are clear and cold. We dig dew traps, black cloth stretched across a timber frame that catches morning dew into shallow gutters. We build sand and charcoal filters, layers of gravel, sand, and charcoal that, when used correctly, take out particulate and some toxins. We boil when we can. Boiling removes biological hazards but not chemical contamination, and the fuel bill is steep. When the sun is willing, we use SODIS, fill clear plastic bottles and leave them in the sun for 6 hours to let ultraviolet light do its work. It's slow and imperfect, and it won't remake a river, but it keeps us from dying of contaminated water in the short term. We barter knowledge as religiously as we barter supplies. I teach people how to splice an antenna for a night's bread. A retired mechanic teaches us how to jury-rig a pump from a broken washing machine. A woman who used to run a florist shows us which wild plants, if any, are safe to eat and which will put you down for days. Those exchanges are the scaffolding of hope, small, stubborn, communal. But hope is precarious. A rumor can be a ladder or a trap. 3 nights ago, a man called in over the radio, a voice I'd never heard, speaking about a buried aquifer 2 days walk north. He described a blue line on a map that no longer exists on our satellite imagery, a place where the well water comes from deep enough to be clean. He talked about a community there with a pump they guard like a treasure. His voice was shaky but certain. The station lit up. People whispered to each other like children deciding whether to believe a tale about a monster. A group of 10 gathered the next morning with pack mules and an assortment of weapons and tools. They left at dawn and took our last spare generator part with them in trade. They haven't returned. The choice to chase that rumor is a calculus of desperation. Each person who leaves thins the safety net at home. Each departing pair of hands is a skill lost. But staying behind means you might wait until the well in your own town dries, and then you know the ledger becomes stark. 1 human, 1 empty bottle, and a slow, certain end. On the radio, I try to hold the line between realism and recklessness. I tell callers when to move and when to stay. I warn them about the route to the bluff where coyotes now travel by night, about the riverbed that turns into a quicksand of soot after rains, about the old gas station whose tanks leach chemicals when flooded. I give technical advice. Boil water for a full minute at altitudes below 2,000 meters. Rely on layered filtration if chemical contamination is suspected, because practical knowledge keeps people alive. But I also know the limitations of what I can teach over the static. An instruction can be a lifeline or a death sentence depending on context. This crisis is not an enemy that can be negotiated with. It is a physics problem, a slow coup of climate against habit. And the human part, the part I can affect with a microphone and a few pieces of wire, is moral and tactical. We must decide whether to hoard or share, whether to defend or dismantle, whether to chase rumors or guard the home. Each choice shapes the network of survival we weave. Tonight there's a low, distant thunder on the horizon. It could be a storm, something that will, if we're lucky, flood the lowlands and refill a reservoir. Or it could be the kind of violent downpour that will wash the soil away from the new crops we coaxed into life. I tighten the straps on the solar array, check the filters twice, and make sure the map of known wells hangs where I can see it. I mark the last coordinates that came in from a caller who said a truck stalled at mile marker 12 by a collapsed bridge. Maybe there's fuel in the cab. Maybe there's a radio. Maybe there's nothing. Maybe there's everything. These are the choices that define us now. We play them against a background of weather and physics and human appetite. The ledger reads differently each morning. Some mornings we add a credit, a well that held a child who lived. Other mornings the bills come due. Either way we continue. We keep the transmitters warm, the filters clean, the stories ready. Because in the end the crisis is not only the drought or the fires or the storms. It is the way they unmake what our neighborhoods were and force us to decide, day by day, what kind of people we will be when the sky has turned against us. And when the thunder comes closer, I will speak into the microphone and tell whoever is listening where to find shelter and how to purify what rain falls. I will say, as plainly as I can, we are still here. We will do what we must. They come in waves now, hunger, heat, rumor, each one folding over the last until it's hard to tell where one ends and the next begins. The ration tins shrink. The stacks of batteries in the cabinet rattle like teeth. The little community that gathers around the radio grows thinner one week and patches together again the next, like a wound that never fully heals. Water is the slowest thief. It does not take everything at once. It eases away in degrees. The cistern we dug last year that promised 3 months of safety is down to less than a week's worth at our current use. We've tightened allowances to a discouraging clinical level. 2 liters a day for cooking and drinking. A trickle for hygiene if you can stretch it. I watch people measure those liters with the kind of concentration usually reserved for surgery. A child's tear is a heatstroke bell that nobody can afford to pull. Food is the same arithmetic. The last shipment from the trading caravan was 2 crates of rice and a box of canned peaches that tasted like sunshine for a single afternoon. We've eaten through canned meat, ration bars, and, shamefully, the seeds we were supposed to plant next season. Fuel is almost mythic, less than a barrel kept in a hidden pit that we cycle through for the generator, needful operations, and the occasional vehicle run. Each time the generator fires to life, it sounds like a gasp from something that wants to sleep forever. We schedule its runs like hymns, morning and evening, so voices can check in and so the pump that filters our last clear well can run for an hour each day. Those hours matter. They are small islands of normalcy we build around. A radio hour where we share names and news. A kitchen hour where one person cooks while another watches the horizon for movement. But islands are fragile. The night the raiders came, we almost lost hours. They moved like a pack, quiet, economical, and practiced. I heard them before I saw them. The metallic clink as a bolt was loosened, the muffled cough of a suppressed engine, the low, human conversations that tried and failed to sound casual. They picked targets carefully. Raiders rarely come to roadsides for sport. They come for supply logic, the places that have irrigation, the scouting reports that show a working cistern, the broadcast notes that mentioned a clinic with antibiotics. One of their scouting parties hit a small satellite settlement on the ridge 2 weeks ago and took 3 goats, 2 weeks of fuel, and the pride of a small community who never recovered their sense of safety. We learned how to fight them that night. Mrs. Klein, who used to stitch quilts in a sunlit shop, hammered 2 warning bells into our perimeter fence. Jonah, when he was alive, would have called the alarm system primitive but effective. We filled old barrels with broken glass, stretched wire across likely entry paths, and dug trenches that would funnel anyone on foot into a narrow corridor where our few rifles and the will to defend could matter. We trained children to find cover and taught the elderly to stay low and quiet. No one wanted bloodshed, but no one anymore could afford to be naive. The raiders hit at dusk, a strategic hour when shadows are long and tiredness makes people sloppy. The first thing they tried was psychology. A single figure walking away from the settlement, carrying a limp with the slow shuffle of someone who wants to be noticed and pitied. When Mara, our unofficial lookout, saw him, she hesitated. She had a grief of her own and wondered if compassion might make a friend. The figure came close enough for her to see the black eyes gleaming like polished coal, and the smile too practiced to be apologetic. When they revealed their intent, it was fast and ugly. A firefight that lasted 40 cursed minutes that felt like a year. We held. We counted losses, 2 bruised, 1 broken arm, and a shallow grave for a small dog that had been the town's mascot. The raiders left with smoke in their wake, and 2 of our garden boxes turned over. They took nothing they couldn't carry, but they carried away something else, trust. After that, people measured the horizon the way they used to measure the tide, for danger and for resources. We barricaded windows, moved water barrels into the inner rooms, and rotated watch shifts like a litany so exhaustion wouldn't let someone wander and be taken. Sometimes the danger is less obvious than raiders. There are the people who show up now with doctrine instead of empathy, small cults, survivalist sects with manifestos printed on damaged photocopiers. They promise a place in a walled compound, a future harvested from discipline. They recruit by shame and by the promise of steady water. We had one such recruiter, a man with a voice like syrup and a map of imaginary fortresses, who sat with us and ate a bowl of stew and then told us why our kindness was a sin. He left the way all such preachers leave, with a curse and a promise that we would remember him when the world collapsed again. Some in the group laughed him away. Others listened like a thirst for doctrine can be mistaken for thirst for water. And then there are the rumors, the thread of mystery that both saves a person and undoes them. We get a rumor every month or so. A working well someone found behind an old mill, a community that has built a garden under glass, a cache of medical supplies unearthed in a forgotten hospital. Most are false, the product of hope bending to wish. A few are true. The rumor about a buried aquifer north of here, the one that sent 10 people away with our last spare generator part, has become the ache at the center of our deliberations. We argue about it the way people argue about love, with fury, with tears, and with a stubborn, irrational optimism that this time the story might be real. The people who went north were led by a man named Iker, who had a map that smelled of coffee and confidence. He promised a pump, a spring, and the room to bring back a new life. He taught a small roster of us how to splice a solar connector and how to scalp a locked generator cylinder. They left at dawn and took our last spare generator part with them in trade. We marked their route and waited for the optimism to return with them like scattered, muddy petals. They did not return. Weeks lengthened into a shape of worry, then into a hard cone of dread. We sent 3 patrols along the marked trail. The first found a burned-out truck with the radio still tuned to our frequency, a child's blanket half burned in the cab. The second came across tracks, prints that suggested a fight, and splintered wood where a cart had been overturned. The third found footprints that led to a riverbed and then stopped as if whoever walked there had been carried away. No bodies, no survivors, only an empty generator part wrapped in oilcloth and the cold knowledge that hopes have costs. I began to ask myself, whenever the night was quiet and the generator's hum was a distant thing, whether some myths are more dangerous to belief than to disbelief. The choice to leave is not made in a vacuum. It takes food. It takes courage. It takes labor that was allocated for other things. Each person who leaves thins the skill pool at home and increases the risk to the ones who stay. But each person who takes the risk could return with more than they left. Water, medicine, the rare functioning piece of technology that would transform our canyon of scarcity into a small valley of possibility. My own internal ledger ran thin. I had a map of obligations. The radio station, the people who relied on my signal, the garden that Mrs. Klein tended with a stubborn system of shade cloth and irrigation lines, lines that were losing pressure. I had the ghosts of Jonah and Anna in my chest, Jonah's steady hands and Anna's humming over the oatmeal. Trusting myself had become a different exercise. I was no longer the guy who fixated on the future as a plan. Now I thought in immediate terms. Who would die if I left today? Who would learn to splice an antenna in my absence? Are there people who would use my absence to take what we built? That doubt, sharp, practical, persistent, bent into a moral question that we debated in whispers. Should I join a search? Should I remain? If I leave, the radio might go offline. The transmitter's maintenance is a precise job. Sometimes a bent wire or a melted capacitor is the difference between guiding someone safely and sentencing them to die in a dust storm. My voice had become a navigational aid for strangers. I had spent nights coaxing a terrified caller through a route away from quicksand. Could I surrender that duty to a younger, less experienced person and hope they'd make the same choices I would? Then one evening a stranger called in. Her voice was ragged, but there was a firmness underneath that steadied me. She said her name was Lita, and that she'd once worked as a hydrologist before governments shrank and summers lengthened. She spoke technical language, the kind that felt like music after the long drought of ordinary conversation. Aquifer recharge rates, transmissivity, the signs of a perched water table. She described a fault line north of here, where seismic shifts had exposed deep veins of water in places satellite imagery showed as barren. She said she'd seen a hand-pumped well with a collar of green that glowed at night. She described a marker, a rusted silo with a blue stripe across its side, that matched a ruin I remembered from a childhood trip. The room went quiet as if the static between us were a physical thing. People leaned into the radio like it was a hearth. Lita said she was 3 days away, and that she was traveling with a small, disciplined group who had learned to move light and fast and to avoid roads. Her voice carried practical terms. The depth of the well, the strength of the pump, the number of people they could support. But the voice also carried impatience. They weren't a charity. They needed skilled hands, someone who knew antennas and radios to set up a relay so their location could be defended and supplied if it was worth defending. A dozen things happened at once. Some in our group wanted to pack and leave at dawn. Others wanted to throw a rope and pull Lita in, suspicious of strangers with the precise language of hope. Mrs. Klein wanted to believe. She wanted the garden to be saved. Mara, who had seen the raiders' faces too closely, wanted us to demand proof. She wanted security before movement. I sat with the microphone cold in my lap and tried to listen to the ledger inside my head. There are rules we've made in the last years, rules that are more moral than survivalist. Do not waste a life on rumor. Do not send the unskilled into danger. Never barter away the last of the tools you need to maintain the community. Yet the rules are slippery. Hunger and thirst and the wear of 1,000 small dead edges make principles bend. When Lita finished speaking, she said simply, "If you want to come with a list of tools, a willingness to work, and the knowledge that if it's a trap, we don't come back together." That last line was honest in a way that chilled me. Trust, then, was now a gamble on collective fate. It was no longer simply about me. It was about whether my leaving would make the transmitter fail, whether a young person could be taught to hold a microphone steady and make the choices that I would make. It was also about whether the world outside our walls still had rooms left to shelter us. That night I sat up until dawn, checking the maps, checking the water levels, counting batteries. I went to the garden and adjusted the shade cloth so the tomatoes would hold 1 more week. I checked the transmitter and kissed the cold edge of the microphone like an old friend. I thought of Anna's hands and Jonah's laugh, and I thought of the dozen faces who called this place home. When morning came, we voted. We argued. We measured pros and cons on a scale we had never intended to use. In the end, a small band would go. 3 mechanic-minded people, Mara, and we would leave behind instructions and a crude schedule for the transmitter. We would take the spare set of batteries and a sealed manual on basic radio repair that Jonah had once given me. We would tie a blue ribbon on the radio cabinet so anyone who came later would know we left with the intention to return. The choice was not triumphant. It was a calculus of exhausted hearts. We left with ration packs and a sense of something fragile and important, hope shadowed by 100 possible graves. The radio clicked as usual as we set out. I spoke into the microphone and gave our coordinates and the time we'd be gone, and then I clicked it off. For the first time in a long while, I left without knowing if I would have a voice to guide anyone back. That uncertainty hangs over us now like a storm front. The rising action of our lives is not a single event, but a series of decisions that could break us or make us. We walk under a sky that has forgotten how to be kind. We walk with rumors and raiders at our feet. And as we move, I keep telling myself, quietly, stubbornly, that if we are lucky, the well Lita spoke of will be the beginning of something. If we are unlucky, it will be the place where one more promise dies. Either way, the walk north is the line we have chosen to cross. They said the turn would come at a crossroads, figuratively, not in any map I still trusted, but I imagined it would be quieter than it was. The sky had a dry, metallic grin, the kind that warns you storms are on their way, but never in a way you can predict. Our band moved north on a line of decisions too long to recount. Leave the radio to strangers for a week, carry the batteries, bring Mara for scouting, bring the mechanic who could coax life from anything with a coil. I carried Jonah's old wrench and the weight of promises I had made to people who expected me to be steadier than I felt. The first real sign that something had changed was the green. In a country stripped to bone by heat and ash, green arrives like a confession. It was a thin green, the sickly blue of a plant that drinks from something deep and secret, but it was green nonetheless. We found it at an old silo with a faded blue stripe that Lita had described. The silo leaned like a tired sentinel, its base ringed with a low, mossy bank. A hand pump crouched beside it, half buried in roots and the long grass that has no business existing in our lifetimes. The pump was not what we had hoped for, a grand, cool spring, but it sang when Mara worked the handle. The sound was like a laugh that had forgotten how. Water, dark with mineral and still smelling faintly of earth, rose in a sputter, then in a steady, trembling thread. We cupped it in our hands and tasted the impossible. You cannot describe what that first cup of water does to a ragged band who have been rationing by teaspoons. It reorders priorities, faces unknit, old frost of suspicion thaws. Lita closed her eyes and said thank you in a voice that didn't belong to the scientist I'd heard on the radio, but to a girl who had been given a coat. We worked like greedy children and like careful priests at the pump, filling jerry cans, rigging a makeshift header tank, and debating the depth of the aquifer beneath our boots. Lita's calculations were quick and hopeful. A perched water table, likely recharged from a pocket of ancient seepage, enough for a small community if we could protect the source and keep the pump maintained. We celebrated then briefly. We rationed our joy like everything else. There was laughter, mostly small, incredulous things, and someone sang off-key until we told them to stop. We split the jerry cans between those left behind and those who would return with news. I radioed the coordinates the way I had been taught to, clear, clipped, careful. I wanted the station back home to know we had found something. My chest was full of a boiling, stupid hope that felt like a fever and also like a cure. And then the horizon became a darker line than the green had been bright. They did not come as a wave at first. They came as headlights, too many, pale and deliberate against the long grass. The raiders had apparently learned to move faster and quieter, to track the music of pumps and the odd warmth of human noise. They moved like flies to anything that smelled like a hive. I knew then that water attracts. Water is a light in the dark for everyone who moves without gardens of their own, and whether you come with hands open or fists clenched, you come. The first time they spoke, their leader's voice was polite in a way that made my teeth ache. "We don't want trouble," he said, which is the same thing people always say before trouble. They wanted to negotiate. They wanted to take some water in return for protection. Their idea of protection was the same as every raider's. Control the pump, control the flow. I don't think they thought about the men who would die in the winter if the pump was moved. They thought about the immediate arithmetic, how much more powerful their hunger would be with a steady source. Negotiation went nowhere. I have a talent for being reasonable until the moment I have to be brutal with my own feelings. Negotiation in those moments feels like bargaining with hunger. We bartered some things, tools, a handful of batteries, but when one of their scouts tried to pry open our header tank, the exchange turned. Shots rang like a weather change. Someone screamed. For a second, the world reduced to the smell of diesel and the sting of smoke. We had built a crude defense, an inner ring of barrels and old tires, some wire, a place where people could fall back to if the fight turned south. But the raiders had numbers and aggressiveness bred out of months of being told there was no other way. We fought with the ragged, inventive courage of those who have nothing left to lose, and a few things they refuse to give up. Mara, who had once been a quiet lookout, moved like a storm herself. She had an old hunting rifle that kicked like a mule and an accuracy that made me keep my head down. The mechanic, a thin woman named Rose, turned a scrap metal flap into a shield that we used to funnel attackers away from the pump. The battle was a mess of noise, dust, and the sickening clarity of someone learning they can kill to get water. I had not killed anyone before the fall. There were other Jordans and other Johns back then who would have gnashed their teeth about violence. But survival has a way of revising a person. I could feel Jonah in my muscles when I moved, as if his steadiness had become my reflex. I fired at a man who moved too quickly toward the pump and felt something in me snap. The world after that is a collage. A face in the dust, a small child in the back with wide eyes, a broken headlight that spilled light like a wound. When the raiders finally retreated, their leader dragging a limp man between them, the field smelled like wet cloth and oil. We counted and grieved and tended wounds. The pump still worked, though it was nicked and leaking. We had won, in the tiniest sense, enough to keep the water flowing for the immediate hour. But winning taught a hard lesson. Possession makes things visible on maps drawn by hunger. We had to make a decision about defense and about priorities. The pump was worthless if the cost of defending it was the destruction of the people we were trying to save. We had to change the equation. The true turning point was practical and terrible. The generator we had brought to power a small pressure system was overheated, half dead, and its last usable spark lay in a battery that could keep the radio alive for between 12 and 36 hours depending on load. We needed the pump to run for more than minutes. We needed it to run long enough to fill cisterns and to allow us to set up a gravity-fed distribution. But the only way to do that with the equipment we had was to take the radio's battery line and reroute it to the pump, effectively sacrificing our ability to transmit. It is strange how decisions crystallize in a moment. In the quiet before the sunset, the group gathered. Lita, stoic in a way that made me ashamed for being loud, explained the math. If we ran the pump on the generator, and then on the batteries until we could build a new capillary system, we could establish a supply that would sustain 12 people easily. If we kept the battery for the radio, we could call back to the enclave and perhaps get help, or at least alert them that water existed. Both options were moral and practical and impossible together. My mind flashed with memory. Anna's coughing, the clinic shelves empty, the radio's voice a salve when it told someone how to avoid a quicksand hole. I felt Jonah's weight again, his steadiness, his small, necessary acts. If I chose the radio, I thought, maybe more people could come and be saved in the long run. If I chose the pump, the people standing in front of me would not die tonight. It was the oldest ethical knife. The many versus the few, abstract hope versus immediate life. I thought of the child whose eyes I had seen in the skirmish, of Mara's hands, of Mrs. Klein's bent back. I thought of the men who had wandered away chasing rumors and not come back. I listened to the hum of the dying generator as if it were a voice telling me to be brave in a way I did not feel. And then I chose. We rerouted the battery. It was not a theatrical sacrifice. There were no speeches. There was the cold, metallic smell of wires being stripped, the clumsy prayer of those who have learned to wire without instruction, and the soft, steady hands of the mechanic who believed in copper and in making things work again. I felt the radio go dead when the final connector was made. Not an instant drama, but a slow, merciful dimming that felt like a curtain falling. For a second, I stood with the dead microphone in my hands and felt the absence like a physical thing. The station would be off for days. The people who depended on my voice, lost truckers, callers who used my coordinates, would have silence. I felt that weight like a stone in my throat. Then the pump coughed, then sang, and the water rose in a steady, bright line. Cisterns filled. Jugs overflowed. People laughed in a sound that was almost hysterical with relief. Children splashed, ridiculous and furious with joy. The decision bought breaths. but choices have consequences. The next day the raiders returned with more people and a different method. They came not to negotiate but to claim. The presence of water had turned the pump from a secret to a beacon. We had defenses, barrels, a trap, Mari's rifle, but we did not have much else. They surrounded the place with a discipline that suggested someone else had taught them to move like armies. They offered terms: leave the pump, give the battery, surrender the people who had been in the fight. When I stepped forward to argue, a hand closed on my arm, Lita, hard as rock. "We give them nothing," she said. "We show them we can fight, or we do something worse." "What is worse?" I asked. She looked at the pump, at the jerry cans, at the faces behind me, and chose words like a miner chooses a path through rock. "We make the water useless to them. We deny them a reason to come here." Her plan was brutal in its logic. If the raiders could not take the pump and could not defend it, they might shelve the place and come back later. Or worse, they might escalate. Lita proposed what engineers and desperate people propose when they have nothing left to lose: disable the pump beyond quick repair so it would not be a prize. In other words, sabotage it for the greater survival of the group. My hands tightened on Jonah's wrench. The moral calculus I had made an hour ago, sacrifice the radio to run the pump, came back in a new, harsher form. This choice would permanently scar the one place we had found. It would be an act of denial in the face of appetite. It would be an act that declared survival by starvation of the hungry rather than by shared life. I thought of Anna's small face and thought of the child in the dust. I thought of Jonah's laugh and of the names on my radio cabinet. I thought of possibility, of making this place a beacon, and of the way beacons attract both help and harm. The lever in front of me was heavy: destroy access and keep our people safe for a time, or fortify and risk being overrun. I did not want to be the man who closed a door on hope, but I also did not want to be the man who let the people here die so strangers could feast. In that hollow, something like clarity settled. We did not destroy the pump. We did instead something else. We learned how to share its benefit without making it a lure. We built a camouflage distribution, a slow drip into hidden cisterns, and we moved the visible pump away from the prominent line of sight. We set traps that did not mean death, noisemakers and trip lines, and we sent out misinformation by way of scattered footprints pointing to ruins miles away. We taught the children how to be silent and how to move water in stealth. We organized watches in a way that made the raiders think we were more than we were. It was a small triumph of cunning over brute force, and it cost us pride and comfort. The climax did not look like the end of a storybook. It looked like a group of ragged, frightened people choosing cunning over surrender and making a small, fragile future. I left that place with water in our jerry cans, with a bruise across my ribs where rust had caught me, and with the hum of a generator that had given us life and taken the voice in equal measure. As we walked back, the sky grumbled like a far-off judge. My hands were black with oil and my mouth tasted like the pump's red metal. I felt oddly light for the first time in months. I had sacrificed the microphone, yes, but in its place I had the immediate scent of water and the small, unlovely fact that people were alive. The sacrifice sat in my chest like a warm stone. There will be cost, and the ledger is not closed. The radio will be off for a time. There will be those who cursed my name in the absence of a signal. There will also be those who drink from cisterns tonight because of a choice I made. The turning point, when I rerouted the last battery and when I refused to hand over what we had, was not an ending but a pivot. It was the moment the story stopped being about what I told over the air and started being about what we did with our hands. In the dark that followed, with the generator a distant, faithful cough, I understood something I had been avoiding since Anna's fever. Survival isn't an act of broadcast. It is an act of presence. It is a hand on a pump, an eye on the horizon, a small, private courage. I had always thought my work, the radio, was how I kept people alive. That night I learned that sometimes you keep people alive by making the hard, immediate choices that no one will sing about. We walked back with water and with theft of sleep. The sky threatened more storms. The horizon was a question, but my pockets were heavy with the absurd, human weight of filled jerry cans. I carried them like proof that we could be practical and stubborn and still be human. The pump kept singing for 3 days straight after we wired the battery to it. It was a small, steady music, metal on metal, the kind of repetition that settles the nerves, and I learned to wake to it the way people once woke to church bells. Cisterns filled. Jugs lined the shade like patient animals. Children who had been thin as peeled fruit glowed in the afternoons, their cheeks plumping from the slow, miraculous intake of clean water. For a while the arithmetic balanced. Mouths fed, wounds washed, the sick given a chance. But balance is a brittle thing now. The immediate victory of water brought a new set of problems that weren't romantic or heroic. Plumbing and maintenance, theft and jealousy. The small, grinding work of keeping a thing working when resources are short. A hand pump is a machine that thirsts for parts and care. The seals wore, threads rusted, the mechanism jammed with grit. We learned to change O-rings with improvised tools and to grind metal filings away with a broken file. The mechanic, Rose, spent long hours with an oil rag draped over her shoulder, muttering at the pump in the way old men used to mutter at stubborn tractors. Lita taught 2 of our younger folks how to test for nitrate levels with strips she'd carried in a small waterproof bag. Knowledge became the first kind of currency. There was cost. We paid it in things I can still taste. A man with a clean face who had come back from a scavenging run, dead of an infected wound, because we'd sent the antibiotics with an outgoing team. The neighbor whose stubbornness made him refuse help until it was too late. The petty theft of a jug or 2 in the night that didn't matter much to an individual, but signaled a slow erosion of trust. We buried 3 people in the first month after the pump. 1 in a shallow grave near the ridge, 1 by the old mill, and a child who had fought a fever too long. Burials are quick now. They are small ceremonies of necessity with a handful of salt and a folded cloth. The raiders came back twice. The first time they tried a more diplomatic approach, men with cleaner faces and men who smiled better. We let them try their smile. Smiles are cheap. They left with nothing but a bruise on their leader's cheek and a plan to find another pump somewhere else. The second time they attacked more cleverly and from more directions, perhaps learning from their earlier humiliation. It was a long night of noise and running and the peculiar geometry of fear. We defended the pump by doing what we had learned. Move water quietly, break visible lines of sight, send out misinformation, and set non-lethal barriers that turned a frontal assault into a bad investment. We lost a goat to a trap that turned out to be crueler than intended. We learned the price of improvisation. We learned also that every action births a reaction. In protecting ourselves, we had hardened into the sort of people who might one day be mistaken for those we once feared. The radio stayed dark. The silence where my voice used to be was a physical absence, like a missing tooth in a grin. People called the station in the nights and found only the flat, indifferent hush of open air. Some cursed me for going north. Some thanked whatever gods they still believed in that our band had water. I answered neither accusation nor thanks anymore, because silence had become my companion and my penance. I felt at times like an exile from my own life. The man who once kept people connected now had to trust that the connections could survive a season of quiet. That absence taught me a different lesson about leadership and responsibility. Broadcasting had been my moral map. I judged myself by the number of hours I kept the transmitter warm, by the callers I steered away from quicksand, by the names I read into the quiet so people felt less alone. But when the battery went to the pump, the map redrew itself. Leadership is not always a voice on the air. It is sometimes a hand in the dirt, a wiring diagram given to a teenager, the patient teaching of how to splice a sun panel so the lights in a room might go on. I found that slowness suited me. I learned how to teach, and to accept that teaching is a different kind of broadcast, one that does not reach a million, but reaches the few who will keep the machine alive. My thinking shifted from syndicated compassion to intimate stewardship. I still longed for the broadcast, for the small miracle of a voice answering, and the world feeling less empty because of that reply. But I stopped measuring my worth by airtime. I began to measure by the hardness of the seals I could repair, the number of name tags sewn into jackets, the way a child learned to carry water without spilling. Those are small metrics, and they feel ridiculous to tally compared with the old world's grand narratives. But they matter now. Nature, in its small part, answered us back. Around the silo, the grass thickened where the slow seep fed the soil. A kind of reed found a place to root in the lee of the cistern. Tiny blue flowers unmown, improbable, pushed through grit and opened like apologies. Those small greens are fragile. A dust storm or a sustained dry wind could erase them in a day. But they altered the landscape of our morale. Children tended the marginal patch with the seriousness of priests. That patch did not mean the climate had reversed itself. The heat still hollowed us out in August, and the rain still came in violent hits. But the patch meant that pockets of life can persist if protected. We rebuilt some institutions in micro. An evening watch that promised rotation and rest. A barter ledger pinned to the back of the radio cabinet where trades were logged and misdemeanors forgiven if the offender repaid with labor. A seed library. A battered tin box where people left and took seeds advised by Rose and Mrs. Klein. We were rudimentary, but permanence is born of repetition. Each repeated act checking the seal, teaching a child to find shade, recording a name in the cabinet, stitches the ragged edges of our community into a seam. I changed in subtler ways. The man who rerouted the battery is not the same man who left the radio with a clear conscience months before. I found my capacity to make hard decisions extended and hardened. I found that I could hold contradictions. I loved both the idea of being the voice for people beyond our hill and the idea of being the pair of hands that steady the pump. Guilt sits with me in the nights. Guilt for the people who left to chase rumors and didn't return. Guilt for burning the radio's light for the pump's life. But guilt also anchors me. It keeps me human. It keeps me refusing to defer difficult choices to theory. There are small, hopeful changes beyond our canyon. Word of the pump spread on tongue and trail, softened by rumor and hardened by fact. A traveling fair of traders came through 1 month later. 3 carts, 2 of them battered, one a child on a mule who traded a box of sewing needles for a week's worth of clean water. They brought news of another enclave up the valley that had built a cobbled solar array, and a greenhouse under glass that actually held humidity long enough to germinate fragile things. News travels now in breaths and in barter, and each piece of it is precious and suspect. And still, the ledger is not balanced. Climate's larger hand presses us from outside. The storms remain erratic and sometimes cruel. The fire seasons still come with a speed and appetite that make evacuation plans feel like prayers. The aquifer we tapped is not infinite. Recharge is slow, and the depth of extraction must be monitored. We set a schedule. Pump 4 hours a day for a month, then test, then adjust. Discipline becomes a survival policy. I have taken to writing a different kind of broadcast, lists. Lists taped inside the radio cabinet, lists that are both pragmatic and loving. Who knows how to fix a solar inverter, reads 1 line, followed by names. Another list catalogs medicines and their expiry. Antibiotics, painkillers, a lone vial of insulin whose owner is counted and cared for. I keep these lists like a litany because the mind likes orders, and because names are tiny resistances to oblivion. The silence of the station is still an ache, but it is an ache with a function now. It reminds me that a voice alone could not have built what we have. A voice alone would have been a map, but not the bridges. My voice will come back someday, I think, but it will be a different voice. One that speaks not only to the transient mass of the lonely on the road, but to the small, stubborn community we have cobbled into being. When I imagine bringing the transmitter back online, I imagine a network of voices, not one man shouting into the dark, but a chorus of small transmitters, each held by someone who can fix a wire and sew a seam and teach a child to carry water without spilling. I do not romanticize the future. There will be more losses. There will be raids and betrayals and men who choose fear over kindness. There will be storms that make us small again. But there are also nights when I sit by the pump under a sky so thin the stars look like dust motes, and I listen to the sound of water falling into a cistern and feel something like permission to sleep. We keep the lists updated. We rotate watch. We teach. We suture torn skin and tell stories about the blue sky like a fable told to coax a child to sleep. The earth around the pump is a patchwork of footprints, those who came and left and those who stayed. I have a new kind of ledger now, less about airtime and more about accountability. I note who learned to splice a wire, who learned to test water, who found a seed that germinates under ash. These are the currencies of the slow work of rebuilding. In the end, the aftermath is a long, ongoing negotiation. The crisis is not vanquished, only negotiated with, day after day. Hope exists in fragile forms, an old man's repaired hands, a child who knows how to boil, a community that now has the language and muscle to keep a pump singing. It is modest and stubborn, and for the moment enough. At dusk I walk to the pump and lay my hand on its cool metal. It is warm from the day, a living thing that answers if you pay attention. I close my eyes and think of the microphone in the dark back at the shack, silent and patient. I will return to it when I can. For now, my place is here, and the water in my palm is proof that even in a world that has learned to betray itself in small ways, there is still room for the deliberate kindness that keeps us alive. The night was quiet in a way that almost fooled you. The wind had dropped, leaving only the distant, low moan of a dying generator and the faint trickle of water from our hidden cistern. I sat on a rock beside the pump, hands resting on my knees, trying not to think too hard about tomorrow. But of course, thinking about tomorrow is unavoidable when survival is never a static state. Every dawn brings a question. Where is the next storm coming from? Who will be at the door? What resources will run out first? Hope is fragile, yes. It does not roar or demand attention. It whispers and teeters like the candle flame in a high wind. And yet, even fragile, it can guide action. Our small victory with the pump has been a lifeline, not a promise. Water flows today, yes, but that flow requires vigilance, repair, and constant attention. A storm could wipe it out. A careless action could poison it. A more determined group could seize it. That's the reality of the world now. Survival is not won once. It is fought again every day. I think about the people I've seen along the way. Faces of strangers, desperate or broken, who sought shelter or information, or sometimes just a voice in the static. Some are gone, taken by illness, accidents, the slow starvation of the environment, or violence that comes naturally to a world stripped bare. Others have stayed, and they are the reason we continue to try. Every day I see the weight of responsibility, keeping them alive, teaching them, guiding them. More important than any broadcast, any transmission. In a way, the world feels like a series of small battles stitched together by hope. We repair what can be repaired, we guard what is precious, and we teach the next generation the language of survival. Each act is a tiny rebellion against the collapse. Children carry water with care, learning what we once took for granted. Adults work together to patch leaky tanks and replace corroded pipes. Even laughter returns now and then, sharp, sudden, almost shocking in a world so often muted by ash and fear. There are victories and losses, joy and grief, often in the same breath. I have learned to measure life not in grand achievements, but in the small, deliberate acts that keep us alive. A pump that functions, a wound that heals, a seedling that survives the heat. These are the currencies now. And though the world outside remains harsh, storms, fires, dust storms, rogue bands of scavengers, the rhythm of small triumphs gives us a tether, a reason to stand, to continue, to imagine the next day. The silence of the radio station still gnaws at me. Its quiet is a constant reminder that connection is more than a broadcast. It is shared work, trust, and vigilance. I plan to return to speak again into the ether, but differently. Now my voice will carry not just warnings, but lessons and stories. Stories of how to survive, of how to work together, of how fragile hope can be nurtured into something sustaining. It will be a voice not only for the lost and wandering, but for the community we are building here. I look at the sky. Stars spill faintly through the thinning clouds, and I remind myself that even in a world altered beyond recognition, fragments of beauty remain. The air still carries dust, the sun still burns, but the smallest constellations persist. They are a quiet kind of reassurance. The universe has not forgotten order, and perhaps we can learn to find our place in it again. There is no finality. The drought will return, the storms will rage, the raiders may come again. But we are learning not to wait for a perfect world. We are learning to persist within the imperfection. Every repair, every guarded cistern, every shared meal is a refusal to give in to despair. And in this refusal lies the essence of hope. Not naive hope, not the hope of stories told in a world that no longer exists, but the hope that acts, no matter how small matter. I do not know what tomorrow holds. I cannot promise survival to anyone beyond this moment, yet I can promise effort, vigilance, and care. For now, that must be enough. I will continue to teach, to guard, to repair, and to keep the flame of our fragile existence alive. It is not heroic. It is not perfect. It is human. So I sit beside the pump, feeling the water pulse steadily beneath my hands. I think of the people who are counting on me, of the children who will remember these lessons, of the moments of quiet joy that punctuate the struggle. I feel the weight of responsibility and the warmth of small victories. The night is fragile, the hope is fragile, and yet it persists. Stay alive. Stay human. Keep the small victories close and the fragile ones closer. The world might be broken, but in our presence it is not yet defeated. And as long as we breathe, there remains a chance. Not certainty, not safety, but a chance to endure, to resist, and to hope again tomorrow. This is my message. Survive, adapt, nurture, and remember that even in the harshest seasons, small acts of courage and care can ripple outward. They are quiet, almost invisible, but they are life. And for today, that is enough to fight for. We do not know what comes next, but we can meet it with hands that are ready, eyes that are alert, and hearts that refuse to surrender. The radio may be silent for now. The storms may gather beyond the horizon, but we are still here. And as long as we are here, hope, however delicate, endures.